My name's Alyssa. I'm with the Artisan Grain Collaborative, and I'm very happy to introduce my friend and colleague, Wesley Rieth. He is going to talk to us about identifying diverse markets. Do you want questions throughout? Is that okay? Yeah. So call it out if you've got questions, and Wes will repeat them for the video. Is that okay?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you. So my name is Wes Rieth. I farm in Southwest Michigan with myself. Tucker Gibbons, my colleague, is also here, and his thoughts also very much contributed to kind of what we're talking about today. I'm going to kind of take it a little slow here at the beginning to let some folks kind of move in. I know the last session went long, but the general topic is looking at diversifying your markets with adding a food grade grain into what I would call like a more conventional corn, soybeans rotation. And that's a pretty big chunk of a topic to kind of try to bite off. So I'm going to kind of highlight a couple pieces of that. I think I was having a conversation earlier today with another grower from Michigan, and we were kind of talking about this idea that there's really no one-size-fits-all strategy when it comes to, diversifying your marketing. Every farm is going to have different markets, going to have different geography, going to have different options. So I think the approach that I took with trying to lay some of this out is kind of just looking at some of the tools that we use to kind of make good marketing decisions or make good diversifying decisions in this way. So hopefully, the tools make sense and you can apply that to your own context and your own farm versus just me kind of trying to be too prescriptive about what it is that we've done. So a little bit about us, about our farm. We're doing a fairly diversified grain rotation: corn, soybeans, wheat, rye, and barley, not necessarily in that order. But those are our mainstay crops that we're growing. And in terms of diversifying our markets, what's looked like, how that has looked for us is primarily the craft beverage market in Michigan, just because we have that market availability. So we kind of started going down this path in 2017, 2018, and you could throw a rock and hit 10 breweries in any direction, it seemed like. So there was just a ton of like this, craft beverage was a thing. And so between the distilleries, the breweries, the maltsters, the millers, those are the folks that we primarily market to. So when it comes to our farm and what we're doing, that's how we have started kind of going down this food grade path. And there's some other pieces to that, but those are really the lion's share of what we're talking about. I actually kind of like this picture too to start because in the background, this is at our bin site. In the background, we first built a couple just standard flat bottom grain bins when we kind of started building this out, which are great. You've got the aeration, you've got temperature control. I think all of that's a little bit better with the flat bottom false floor style. And then as we kind of moved down this path of food grade, we added what you see more in the foreground, which is the cone bottom style bins. And those presented, while they don't have the airflow, they don't have the temperature control of the flat bottom, they do offer a couple advantages for food grade. So buyers want typically like some kind of segregation or identity preserved crop, and these bins were intentionally built smaller so we keep things separate. They're also super easy to clean out, and that's a big one. And so those of you that have spent more than a day cleaning out flat bottom bins know that having that kind of ease to get one crop in and move or get one crop out and move another one in really quickly, that plays really nicely into like a food grade rotation. So that's why we elected to do like these several hopper bottom bins versus just like putting up another bigger bin because we've got several different things going on at the same time. So that was intentional. We actually built those bins ourselves. As a side note, don't know if I would recommend that. That was a lot of work. The first one took like 3 weeks, and the last one we could do it in about 3 days by that point because we just kind of did it over and over. But that was a lot of bolts, a lot of building. All right, well, let's get into it. So I feel like for most farmers, and I'm going to be speaking primarily from the farmer perspective today because that's what I am and that's kind of where I'm coming from. When we're talking about adding something into our farms, I think there's primarily 3 things that drive those decisions. At least for me, this is kind of what it looks like, and these are broad groups. But there's this idea of what are the economic implications, the agronomic, and like the infrastructure implications of bringing something in this case, a food grade grain and maybe a different market. So what I'm going to talk about today is primarily this kind of ellipse that I've drawn here, which is kind of the economic ramifications of all of this. Not to say that the agronomics aren't important or the infrastructure isn't important. Those are very, very important, but I think they're more farm specific. And if you have questions about those things, I'm happy to get into it, but we're gonna primarily focus on like the economic side today. So two primary, I think, like tools I want to look at when it comes to figuring out how to diversify on your farm. The first is really getting dialed in on cost of production, because I think that influences a ton of decisions that you can make further down the line. And the other half of that I'm really going to lean into is some like forward contracting ideas, because that I think meets some of like this risk assessment head on when we start talking about food grade stuff. So yeah, we're going to talk about using cost of production as a tool for planning crop rotations, specifically for food grade grains in this case, and who your available end users are, kind of the key variables to track, things like fixed versus variable costs. So some of these different like cost of production type things, and then some key differences between how we look at that with a feed grade crop and a food grade crop. Some what I'm going to call prerequisites for incorporating food grade grains into your rotation. Looking at storage would be one of those things. Like I said, the forward contracts, and then all of this, again, speaking from a farmer's perspective. So I think for context, it's kind of important to talk a little bit about how we do things on our farm. You can compare it to how you do things. I'm going to talk about what our crop rotation or our crop sequence is. I'm stealing this term from Joel Groover. He likes to talk about crop sequences as opposed to rotations. I really like that idea of like what follows what instead of a rotation, because Mother Nature always seems to kind of get in the way of what we want the rotation to be sometimes. But our aspirations for a crop sequence are, a heavy focus on what we can sell food grade in Michigan, trying to avoid a grass on grass situation. Exception we've done is like some corn to oats, and we've done corn to some other things. We plant other things into corn stubble sometimes. We try to avoid grass on grass. We try to have active roots through the winter. We try to have a relatively long turnaround, 5-6 years. We try to reduce tillage. That's our aspirations. What does it look like in reality? Well, it's not quite there. I think we're still too grass heavy, probably in a rotation. We can't do spring planted cereals in our neck of the woods. We tried it a couple times. It just was a mess every time. We try to add legume cover crops wherever possible to add something diverse into the rotation. Soybeans are really becoming more of a thing where we're only doing it in select situations, especially organically, just because of the weed pressure that often comes with that. We're also doing some non-GMO or some non-organic production and organic production side by side. So that's a little bit different. And finally, because we're going to talk about these crops, I think it's important to say that wheat and rye and barley for us have been tough to pencil out just in a commodity-based system. So what we can get for those crops per bushel, it's tough to like make that break even a lot of years. So we're gonna, part of this is kind of thinking through creatively how we have tried to solve for that. So speaking now directly about cost of production, like what is the usability of that in talking about marketing and how we develop markets? I think what we're trying to do is answer these types of questions. What's a profitable sale price? Like what do you need to sell your crop for in order to make money? That's a really important question, I think, for us as farmers to be able to answer. What does a profitable crop rotation or a sequence look like? What tillage and weed control practices have a positive ROI? What pieces of equipment have a place on my farm or don't have a place on my farm? And are my efforts to market my crop effective? I think one of the things that all of us kind of in this food grade realm have found as we've started to talk to buyers is nobody knows what to charge or purchase a crop for. Like we're playing by a rule book that doesn't exist yet. It's pretty easy, on the other end of the spectrum, when we're talking about conventional corn and beans, anyone can look at the Chicago Board of Trade at any moment in time and know exactly what the price is that's being offered. And we're on the totally other end of the spectrum, not that one is bad or good, but on the food grade side, when we're introducing a new crop or growing open pollinated corn or doing something, like we don't really have that knowledge. So we have to figure out a way to come up with a price that makes sense. And one of the differences, and this isn't economics 101, so hang with me here, but I think this was helpful for me to think through as we started to talk about a cost of production. and just kind of understanding the baseline fundamentals of what go into it. So a fixed cost in an agricultural sense, I think, is a cost that doesn't depend on your level of production. So these are things like land and machinery, depreciation, interest. Your scale of growing a crop theoretically won't change your fixed costs. And there's an asterisk kind of next to that in my mind. We're going to come back to it. Variable costs are the easy ones. Those kind of depend changing on, your production level. So if you plant more acres, you need more seed, that cost goes up, right? It's variable depending on how much you're growing. Labor is a tricky one. An economist might have a theoretical answer here. I think from an agricultural perspective, we know as farmers, most people would put it in the fixed cost bucket, but it really isn't fixed, because the more you grow, at some point you do need more labor. So that's a tricky one. And I add this underneath labor because I think as farmers, we are sometimes not as good with incorporating labor into our budgets, because either we like the work, we're doing the work because we like it, so we don't pay ourselves, or pay ourselves very little to do it because we find so much enjoyment in it, which I think on the one hand is admirable, right? Because we're doing a job that we love. On the other hand, I think we have to find a way to account for labor, because it helps influence our marketing, our growing decisions. If we're growing something that we can't pay ourselves enough to grow, that doesn't feel like a good long-term decision. So that's my encouragement on the labor front. This is a visual that I like to kind of use to think about spatially the relationship between fixed and variable costs in an agricultural system on a farm. So the orange line would represent your variable costs, and your that blue dashed line would be the fixed costs, and you're going to have these different inflection points with your fixed costs. At the bottom, I have a scale for acres. I just made these numbers up. Don't pay attention to the numbers. It's the relationship that I think that's important. You have these inflection points where if I'm growing 1,000 acres and we go up to 2,500, I might decide, we need to add another full-time person to the farm, and that's an inflection point where your fixed cost kind of goes up. So I think it's important to kind of think about where those points are, and so what that means for the scale at which you're farming, right? You might need to add another tractor, or you add, there's these other big cost jumps that can, kind of contribute to that. The orange line, maybe is not entirely linear, or it shouldn't be, but those are your variable costs, right? The more you grow, the more you spend on seed, fertilizer, et cetera. Another kind of tricky part of, I think, cost of production from an organic standpoint is how do we account for what it costs to run a tine weeder or a rotary hoe across the field, right? These are passes that we all make. Sometimes they're relatively quick. And so it's hard to come up with an accurate picture of how much did it cost me to just run that tractor across that acre. And the best way the baseline way that we've found to kind of go about figuring out what that cost is, because it's an important line item in your budget, is relying on some land grant resources here. So this is just a screenshot I took. This is from Michigan State. Iowa State does this. Several universities will put out something similar, but this one is looking at what they think it costs to run a 12-row cultivator with 160 horse tractor, and your estimated acres per hour. Your mileage may vary, and just kind of what that cost looks like, and at least gives us a baseline of something to put into our budget to figure out how much does it cost me to do this. So I would encourage you to take a look at this if you're building out a crop production budget. Figure out. I've kind of been thinking about this as we've talked about no-till beans the last couple of days. That's a big advantage of having the no-till bean system, right? With the roll crimped rye is you might eliminate 3 or 4 passes, of in-row cultivation, tine weeding, rotary hoeing, whatever it is, all that's gone. And so even if your yields drop with the no-till rye and bean system, you might actually be profit ahead because you just eliminated 4 or 5 passes. So I think this is where this type of analysis can come in really handy. And then thinking about crop production or cost of production in the long term, here's a couple other things to kind of think about as you go through this exercise. Trying to integrate a crop plan into your cost of production. So looking at, once you have those costs established, look at it over a 3 or 5 year period to say, hey, does a corn, beans, wheat rotation look better on paper, or does a corn, beans, buckwheat rye rotation look better. I think it's, as organic farmers, we have all the luxury and the kind of challenge of looking at these things over a much longer period of time. One of the things that we've tried to do on our farm is we've kind of, looking at crops over a multitude of years. I'm going to use the example of buckwheat as like a crop where if we own a swather and a pickup head, can we farm enough acres of buckwheat every year to amortize or expose that cost over a long enough period of time to make it worth purchasing it, right? So these are, I think, that's an example of a question I think we had to come face to face with on our farm. We talked a little bit about the beginning of kind of my aspirational versus a pragmatic rotation. Corn and soybeans for a lot of us might be the most pragmatic, but it may be not so good for other reasons, and there's some risk exposure, and we're going to get into that a little bit later when you add in other things, especially food grade. And when we talk about food grade specifics, I think there's additional limitations here, like contaminating cereal grains if you're doing wheat and rye and barley. No-till beans offers a point of contamination for the rye volunteer. Multiple corn varieties, you can get cross-pollination. So as we get into the food grade, it gets even more complicated. Not necessarily in a bad way, it just requires that, that planning ahead. And maybe a relatively small aspect of this, but something that worth considering too is when we're talking about like open pollinated corn and other food grade crops, oftentimes you have the opportunity to save that seed versus purchasing it. So there's a cost there too. So this is something that I think really transformed how we look at cost of production on our farm. And again, we're talking about cost of production because that's what influences our ability to market and market successfully when we're talking about food grade buyers. We started using a program this past year called Harvest Profit. We're not sponsored. I'm not up here speaking about Harvest Profit for any other reason other than we enjoyed it. And I think we got some, good learning from that program. So I've got a couple screenshots of that I'm going to share with you. You can see what you think about it. John Deere Ops Center will do some similar things. There's programs like Traction, and Bushel is another one. The O-Grain Compass tool is, I'm pretty sure it's a free one. Someone correct me if I'm, yeah, it's a free one. And so there's a million ways to kind of go about the same thing. So this is just a tool we used. You can also build it all with Excel spreadsheets if you want to put that time in to do that. We chose Harvest Profit just because it gave us some ability to integrate data in a couple ways that we found useful. So these are, a couple platforms you could choose from if you want help kind of establishing a cost of production on your farm. These numbers are mostly made up, so don't rely on the numbers, but this is just a screenshot of what a profit and loss page from Harvest Profit would look like. This is comparing some conventional soybeans versus an organic soybean. It's not really a comparison, it's just the line items that I captured on the screenshot. But basically, it's a cost of production. You can have all the different line items for your budget, everything from, land cost and seed to fertilizer, labor, et cetera. And then the nice thing about this is at the very bottom, you can see a cost per unit. That's basically how much it costs us to grow in this theoretical scenario. How much does it cost us to grow a bushel of conventional or organic soybeans? And so right away, we have a helpful tool to help us see like, okay, if we're selling below this, that's not a good scenario for the long term. This is another screenshot from Harvest Profit and something that I think is pretty cool. They call these like a what-if analysis, I think is the term that they use for it. But basically, it allows you to kind of throw on the left here, we've got a theoretical yield, so 85 bushels there at the top, 15 at the bottom, and then a series of prices running along the top. And this would be like for a conventional soybean. But you can see the green squares are where you're making money on a per acre basis. The red ones are where you're losing money. The yellow ones, you're getting close. So you can factor in and throw in any number of scenarios here and kind of define for your farm with this software anyways, like at a given yield and a given price, this is what that scenario looks like for me on my farm. I like the visual of how this kind of lays things out for us. It helps us make decisions, I think, pretty well on our farm. Again, there's a lot of tools that could do something similar, but this is just kind of where we landed with that. Here's another kind of chart I think that's helpful for someone like me who tries to think a little bit spatially. And we talked about risk, when it comes to kind of diversifying your rotation and what that means kind of on a farm-wide basis. So here's my thought behind the chart. On the x-axis, we've got acres farmed, 0 acres on the left. I don't know what the number is on the right. Make it up, 5,000, 10,000, I don't know. Risk tolerance would just be like very low risk at the bottom, very high risk at the top. And this is how I think about it. It's a little bit subjective, but bear with me here as we kind of walk through this. So the blue line is what I feel like is a risk tolerance for the corn and soybean rotation. On the very left, you've got maybe a higher cost to get into just a corn and soybean rotation because you're relying on more off-farm inputs. But as you grow more acres of corn and soybeans, your risk goes down over time because you've got bigger equipment, you've got more efficiencies. We've seen this happen in agriculture, right? Of the system we've designed in a corn soybean rotation, your risk typically goes down over more acres. Not all the time, I'm making some generalizations, but just as a way of comparing things. The green line is what I'm going to call like a simple food grade rotation. So corn, soybeans, and then a small grain, and maybe a food grade small grain in there. I think your risk with a food grade rotation is primarily slightly less than a corn soybean rotation because you might need less inputs, right? An open pollinated corn might not need as much nitrogen as your hybrid, yellow corn needs right off the bat. And so I think your risk initially is less, but I think it doesn't necessarily follow the same trajectory as a corn-soybean rotation because at a certain point, you start to get more risky with food grade because you need more buyers, right? Your elevators might take an unlimited amount of corn and soybeans, but your food grade buyer is not gonna take an unlimited amount of open pollinated corn or food grade wheat or rye or whatever it happens to be. And I think the same thing is true for like a diversified food grade rotation, because I think your risk is even lower when you get started because you've got a higher value crop that you're starting with on the farm. But I think your risk continues to climb over X number of acres because, again, we've got limitations when it comes to buyers and what they will actually accept. So you can grow a really high value crop, but if no one will buy it from you, it's actually worth nothing, unfortunately. So again, this is a chart that I've actually probably spent too much time thinking about and just kind of wanted to lay it out in the way that it feels in my mind. So if one of you raised your hand and said, I think you're totally backwards in how you thought about this, I would welcome that feedback. And I think that's important and why we're all here. But this is just kind of a way that we're thinking about it. I think on our farm, what that meant with this kind of mindset is we've got a smaller land base, right? We don't have as many number of acres. So if we're going to try to add value and add more profit per acre to support, some full-time wages on less acres, that means we might have to incur a little bit more risk initially in order to get that done. So that's kind of how I thought about this chart. Another exercise that I've found useful when you think about adding a food grade crop to your rotation and how you want to market it is kind of going through this tool that I think is probably from corporate America in some way, shape, or form, but it's called a SWOT analysis. And I'm going to get into that into the next slide. But I think it's important to add this kind of caveat, which is the first bullet point here, which I'm talking a lot about like a corn soybean rotation versus what a food grade rotation or an organic rotation might look like. And my kind of comparison here is not just trying to make one the good and one the bad. It's acknowledging the fact that we have a ton of infrastructure, especially in the upper Midwest, of corn that is developed around corn and soybean rotations, right? Elevators, marketers, fertilizer companies, everyone is kind of dialed in on what it takes to grow corn and soybeans in the upper Midwest. And so that first point is like, I want to acknowledge that paradigm, that it exists. I think it's silly not to. I'm going to try to adapt to that and utilize those resources to the best of what we can do on our farm. It doesn't mean I necessarily have to agree with it, and it doesn't mean that I have to follow that program, right? We're trying to capture the strengths of the infrastructure we have while also adding in some different parts and kind of, incrementally moving in maybe a slightly different direction. So that's my, I guess, caveat with all of that. So the next slide, I think, is what I'm going to go through is a SWOT analysis theoretically for like if you want to incorporate heirloom corn or an open pollinated corn on your farm, how I might think about that. So here we go. This is, again, just one crop, and what I think a similar thought process to how we analyzed it when we first started growing some open pollinated varieties. But basically, open pollinated corn was a good place for us to kind of enter into the food grade market because we already had a lot of the agronomic know-how from growing regular corn. So that was a big strength for us, right? We also had the harvest and the planting equipment. We could use the same combine and the same planter. We didn't have to go out and buy something additional to begin growing open pollinated corn in that way. The weaknesses on the flip side were, we really didn't know when we started down this path a lot about varietal selection, like what was going to work well for us. We had some distillers at the time who were asking us to grow Bloody Butcher corn because there was some notoriety around it. There had been maybe a couple media bits about Bloody Butcher corn. It's really beautiful and it's this old variety and it makes really good bourbon, it turns out. So we tried growing that for a couple years and found that it was way too long a maturity of corn to grow in our area of Southwest Michigan. It's 118, 120 day corn, depending on where you find your seed or where it comes from. And typically for a hybridized corn, we're planting a 95 or 100 day. So that presented a challenge. And the other challenge that we didn't understand, at least initially, was in part because of the maturity difference, but in part because of many other factors. The Bloody Butcher had a habit of falling down a lot, like lodging profusely in most field conditions. And that made it not only difficult to harvest, but it turned our yields pretty low. And so after a point in time, we finally found like, hey, this doesn't really make sense for us to grow. We got to look elsewhere for an open pollinated variety. So that varietal selection piece can be a weakness as you introduce a new crop onto your farm, just because we don't know what we don't know yet. Standability was a big part of that for us. Opportunities for incorporating a food grade grain on your farm might look like, if you have a local-ish outlet for that, whether that's, a baker or a miller, a maltster, a distiller, whoever that happens to be. I think those are real opportunities for wherever your farm is at. And then there's a price premium. There's nothing, we're not really beating around the bush here when we say that there's an economic driver for all of us to incorporate a food grade grain. So that price premium is a big part of the opportunity for us to do that. And then from an open pollinated corn standpoint, what we viewed as the threats to that was potential cross-contamination, right? Corn pollen can go a long ways. So yeah, achieving that genetic purity, especially if you want to save seed. And now we're getting into a point where can we differentiate ourselves enough in the market, or is the market already saturated with a particular kind of product that we could grow on our farm? So here's kind of like my couple take-home points with kind of looking at incorporating food grade grades specifically on your farm. Knowing the cost of production is probably like the most important one for me. And because I say here, without it, you cannot know a good crop from a bad one. And what I mean by that is we can grow, we might be able to grow phenomenal barley every single year. It meets malting grade. We get a decent yield. It looks really great. It fits great in the rotation. There's so many good things about it, but the market in Michigan may not support a price for us to grow that profitably. And so where does that leave us? It means either we have to find a different market or we can't continue to grow that crop on the scale that we have been growing it. And those are hard decisions sometimes, especially as farmers, because we're emotional about the things that we grow. And if they're beautiful in the field and we can do it well, it's really hard to stop doing that. But that's why I feel like knowing an objective number here for your cost of production for each crop is vital. Market conditions, this one is challenging, and organizations like AGC I feel like are really helpful in moving the needle forward on something like this. But before you plant the seed, and we were just, I feel like, talking about this in the dry bean session before, understanding, is there demand for this particular thing that I want to grow? Are you able to store it on your farm until someone can purchase it from you? What's the transportation look like? Can you haul it? Do you need someone else to haul it? What if this crop doesn't make food grade? These are all things I feel like we ought to try to understand before we put the seed in the ground, because then we're at the mercy of so much other risk in addition to market conditions. The risk versus reward piece, we talked about that. There's a pretty well-established, right or wrong, safety net for growing corn and soybeans, and now even to more of an extent like organic corn and soybeans. Are you willing to kind of forego some of that safety net in the exchange for like potentially a higher premium or a higher price per bushel on whatever it is that you're growing? And then finally, and this is, I think, me personally, but also I think helpful for most farmers is, we're really trying to take a non-dogmatic approach to thinking about adding food grain grains in the rotation. I think incrementalism is how I typically approach things, and I think that's pretty helpful, as opposed to saying like, I'm a food grade farmer or I'm a feed grade farmer. Like there's probably room to be both. And I think developing a rotation where we can kind of move fluidly from one to the other is probably one of the more resilient choices we could make with that. So moving on to kind of the second half of this, which I think is another really vital and important piece of diversifying our marketing strategy, especially when we're talking about food grade crops, is thinking about forward contracts. This is only one option of many that you can use, but I think as we start to look at food grade crops, we incur a lot more risk, right? We have a higher risk crop, a higher value crop, and having a forward contract gets rid of some of that risk right away, because we know at the end of the day, here's what I'm gonna get paid and here's how much income I can expect to receive from this crop, and you can kind of work backwards from that. So that's why I think forward contracts are really valuable in that way. I define this, and other people might define it differently, but this is an agreement to sell a specific amount of product at a set price at a defined period of time. I mean, that's what a forward contract basically is. I think there's two main types out there. There might be more now. Quantity contracts, and this is what I would call like the conventional idea of I'm going to contract X number of bushels for X price to be delivered at a period of time or at a set date. The other side that we've kind of seen more of in the last couple years is an acre contract. We've seen this with some seed production, as well as some buyers I think are interested in this. And basically what an acre contract is looking at a particular buyer is going to get all the crop off of a particular set of acres. So if you have a 5-acre or a 10-acre field, a smaller field, and one buyer wants all the corn from that field, they can write an acre contract for these number of acres. And each one has pluses and minuses. I don't think we have to really go into the minutia of what that looks like, but there's pluses and minuses for both, and your buyer might have a preference. Yeah, I think it's important to discuss those pros and cons with your end user, because at the end of the day, you want the forward contract to work for both of you. It's a risk management tool, I think, at the end of the day, is my biggest point with a forward contract, is I want to know what I'm going to get paid later down the road and how much of this I'm going to be able to sell, so I'm not stuck holding a lot of expensive grain on my farm that I can't move. And here's what I mean, I think a little bit about risk management. So when we're talking about food grade, the budget gets a little bit longer and the accounting gets a little bit tricky. We'll have a capital expenditure as a farmer to put the crop in the ground. And I've kind of laid out a sample scenario here, but you can change this for any particular crop or whatever your scenario is. But let's say we're planting a food grade cereal grain in the fall. So we're going to have a capital expenditure to buy seed and potentially fertilizer, fuel, labor, et cetera. This is written as like in August of 2023. We're going to plant that crop in September, October of 2023. We're going to try to market that crop. We're going to, eventually harvest that crop in the following summer. So in 2024, in the summer, we're going to clean it and we're going to store it. And then eventually it's going to be ready to ship and distribute. So maybe 12 months later, maybe 14, maybe 16 months later, you're going to get paid for that crop that you already paid for a year ago, or a year plus ago. And I think that sounds like a little bit pessimistic to say that, but I think it's important to kind of recognize this is how long you might have to wait to be compensated. And the forward contract is important because at least you know what that point B is, all the way your payment side. Like what that value is going to be. And so you can easily, I think, work backward from that to make sure you don't dig yourself into a hole in the meantime from a cash flow perspective. So I think it's important to think about that kind of in this longitudinal view. Here's a sample scenario of something that I think we've thought about a lot on our farm. And again, I'm going to use heirloom corn as an example because a lot of us grow corn. So let's say you're approached by a buyer who wants to purchase some variety of heirloom corn, and they're going to pay you, a nice premium. Maybe you're going to get $13 a bushel for that. That sounds really good, especially after what we heard yesterday morning from our friends at Mercaris, where we're getting, $6 and $7 bids for organic yellow corn right now. $13 sounds great. And I'm making these numbers up, but they're not far-fetched. So at first glance, that number feels really positive. So I've put these up here side by side to kind of walk through what that scenario might look like from a cash flow perspective. So if you've got 2,000 bushels of feed grade corn, you sell it for $9, you get $18,000. That's simplified math. There's no trucking in there. I didn't mess with like a lot of like the little bits, but that your gross income there is pretty easy to kind of come away with. With the heirloom corn, you've got 2,000 bushels and you sell it for $13. Okay, we have a lot more money. We have $26,000 now. However, things to think about, right? There's a cleaning cost. We right now figure about 3 cents a pound to clean, a bushel of corn. So that's $1.68 a bushel. I've also added this line item of like cost of ownership, right? How long right now does it cost, or what does it cost you right now to kind of store grain on your farm, as opposed to putting that money straight into your bank account so you don't have to take out as big of an operating line or whatever. There's a cost benefit here, or an opportunity cost to what that money is doing sitting in your bin versus sitting in your bank account or otherwise. So I assumed 5% interest at $13, and this is a cost of ownership for 3 months, and that costs you another $1.95 a bushel. So when you take away just those two costs, you can see where we're left. And, the net is not really that far off. And that feels a lot different than $13 a bushel or $9 a bushel. So again, this isn't me trying to be a pessimist at all about food grade, because I'm a big proponent of adding, I think, this diversification on our farms. It's just me kind of saying like, hey, make sure we can see this whole picture. And a forward contract can help us do that, about where we're going to start and where we're going to end when it comes to cash flow. Key variables to outline or think about when we talk about forward contracts. Some of these are pretty straightforward. Others we've kind of learned, or I've learned by trial and error and kind of making some mistakes. When you're talking about crop, make sure you specify a variety. If there's quality specs, how much contamination would or could be allowed, all of that's important to kind of make sure is on the contract, particularly important for food grade buyers. And the price feels like a straightforward variable, but make sure you specify with your buyer, like, hey, is that off the farm or is that at your place? Like, am I responsible for trucking, or are you going to come get it? And is there a storage premium? Maybe your buyer gets in a bind where they can't take the 1,000 bushels of wheat that they said they were going to take in May, and so you have to hold it. Well, you probably should be compensated for that. And this is me as a farmer speaking, because we know that bin space doesn't come for free. So those are important things, I think, to write out in a contract. And, the delivery window, I think that's important from a bin space perspective. None of us have unlimited grain bins to put stuff in. So we need to think about, do I need to get a grain bin cleaned out by X date so my summer cereal can have a place to go, or whatever, right? And then a plan B. If your grain doesn't meet spec, then what happens? I think that's important too. I pulled this off of like basically one of our contracts for barley. So this is what a sample spec sheet might look like for some malting grade barley that we grow. And, this is one example. This isn't like the perfect example, but just to give you an idea of what a buyer might be asking for when they're looking at a sample of, in this case, Violetta barley. We went pretty in detail with this particular crop and this particular buyer. I think that type of detail makes it a lot easier later on down the line, because there's just less guesswork, right? If the sample is this or the sample is this, that makes it a very objective decision, and it doesn't have to be emotional, because a lot of the buyers that we get in touch with as farmers, if we're direct marketing, it becomes a very relational, kind of emotional almost interaction. And having this all laid out on your contract just makes it so you're not not friends with that person anymore if your grain doesn't meet spec. It just makes it a much easier conversation to have if things go awry at some different point. I'll talk a little bit about kind of interactions with your buyer more specifically. There's a lot to be said here, and I'm certainly no expert, but a couple things that I've learned, and this is kind of how I think about it, I guess. So when you're looking at talking with a prospective buyer, I usually approach it, especially if it's someone that I haven't purchased from or haven't worked with me before, with this mentality of like, nobody has to buy from me, right? No one is obligated to buy from me as a farmer, and they probably have options to buy whatever this crop is from somebody else cheaper than what I can sell it for. So price is not going to be my advantage as a farmer. I'm probably going to have to figure out some way to add value to this equation so they can purchase from me and still pay me what I think is a fair price to meet my cost of production and hopefully make a little bit. So yeah, meeting the needs of your buyer, what does that look like? It might mean that you are the person that arranges the transportation, or you package it in a way that is advantageous for them. Instead of transporting it by the semi-load, you might say, hey, we'll put it in super sacks, or maybe it's 50-pound bags, whatever the situation is. I think thinking about it in a way of you as a farmer, not only being the farmer, but also adding value to that equation somehow, is a pretty effective way to help, you know, your side of the table when it comes to negotiating what the price ends up being. This is kind of like a tried and true trick, but one that's helpful for me is basically asking the question of, if I get to a point where my buyer will not purchase from me for X price, I would say, okay, what has to be true for you to purchase from me at $13, right? And then like, you can tell me. And I might say that's very silly. Like, I would never do that. Or it might be something that we could easily do as a farm, but unless you ask the question, you don't really understand or you don't know. So I think that's another, like, again, pretty basic, like, psychological tool that helps me as a I'm not a trained salesperson by any means. So these are like little bits that I've picked up from other people who actually know how to make sales and do it for a living. It's like, oh, that actually kind of works. And then finally, and this is like goes back to, I think, the fundamental importance of having a forward contract is, yes is nothing without the how. And what I mean by that is you can get someone to agree to purchase grain from you, but if you don't determine how it's going to get there, or how it's going to be cleaned, or what the specs are, or what the variety is, like that yes that you got them to say, like that doesn't really mean anything, because there's a lot of ways out of that. So establishing kind of all these variables, I think, is pretty important. A common question that we get with forward contracts, especially with food grade crops, is like, how do you go about price discovery? How do you know what to charge? And we've, I think, talked about this at length with the cost of production side of things, but you know, a couple different ways that I've seen folks go about it, which can be fair, is you can look at the Chicago Board of Trade price and you can add a premium. Like, we're going to pay you what Chicago is paying, but we're going to add $4 or whatever. I don't know. That sometimes appeases a buyer that's looking for like something objective to look at. You might also rely on a USDA report. You could rely on a third-party resource if you work with a broker or something like that that can give you some price discovery information. I find it pretty challenging, to understand what price you should charge. And I think the take-home point for me was I just have to know what my cost of production is, and I base everything on that. Another question that we get a lot is, are contracts flexible? Like, if I put myself into a corner with a forward contract, or maybe I oversell, or maybe the crop doesn't meet spec, how much trouble am I going to get in? And the answer is, you're going to get in as much trouble as you wrote the contract to get you in trouble for. And because some contracts can be written very loosely, I would say, and some you can write, very specifically and not leave a lot of wiggle room. So that's something that I think your own personal risk tolerance. That's kind of how you have to navigate that a little bit. So here's my take-home points for implementing forward contracts, I think, on your farm. The first one is the same as kind of looking at the cost of production, which is know your cost of production. I think that's like the fundamental starting point for looking at a forward contract, because then you know if it's a good contract or a bad contract, at least from a pricing standpoint. I think understanding spec requirements is important, and this is very crop specific, but If you don't have the cleaning infrastructure or the cleaning contact or the place to go to get your grain processed to meet a spec requirement, you probably shouldn't be signing your name on the dotted line on the contract, right? You got to understand that ahead of time. Prepare to offer services beyond just being a producer. Can you be a logistics coordinator? Can you help this group with their marketing, right? We've done a lot of this with our farm with a distillery or somebody else who wants to like come out to the field for harvest day and ride in the combine and get a couple videos for Instagram or Snapchat or I don't know, whatever. And that's cool. So these are the kind of things that maybe don't cost you anything, but you can add on to kind of get the deal done. And then finally, as we talked about with like that longitudinal graph of like, consider cash flow. You're going to spend the money now. You might have to wait 14 months to get the money back, and then hopefully a little bit of interest to cover everything. Here's just a couple learning opportunities that we've gone through, and then we can go to like a question and answer after this. But things that we've learned on our farm, I made a mistake a couple times of not specifying a delivery window with a forward contract. And it presented a situation where we had to move a crop and the buyer couldn't take it. They just physically didn't have the space. And that's not because the buyer was doing something wrong and no one had ill will or ill intentions to the other, but it just presented us with a really bad situation where we had to all of a sudden look elsewhere to try to sell this crop or sell it for feed grade when it should have been food grade. And that means you're usually selling it for a loss. So that wasn't a great scenario. Setting the price below the cost of production, like that's long term, that just is not an economic feasibly way to go about running your farm if you're selling below the cost of production. Like we have to have that weighted average at least above or at your cost of production to keep things going. And there's some upside risk with forward contracts, you know, especially with like what we saw with soybeans a couple years ago. You know, we could sell soybeans for what we think is a good price, and then a year later when it's time to deliver those soybeans or whatever the crop is, the price could be a lot higher. And that's the risk you take with a forward contract, is the price is what the price is, and if it goes up, well, I guess you're out of luck. And then just a couple other learning opportunities when it comes to like cost of production or crop sequences. We've found it pretty challenging to incorporate organic soybeans on a lot of our acres because of the weed pressure, not necessarily in the soybean year, although that is bad, but because of what it does to crops later down the sequence. So we're pretty strategic now about where we do organic soybeans. There's always a balance between agronomic and economic factors on your farm, right? And typically these two buckets of agronomics and economics should overlap and have a lot of things like interacting between them and like this theoretical Venn diagram. But I think we sometimes make the mistake as organic farmers of focusing maybe slightly too much on the ideal rotation or the ideal species to have in the field, and that can maybe put us in a position economically where it's not great. So I think balancing those two, it's kind of feels like a tightrope to walk sometimes, but I think that's important. And then, you know, for cost of production, the biggest thing for us was understanding our labor cost. How much does it cost us to have a tractor in the field to do X number of passes on this crop, and what does that do to our bottom line? And if it's bad, or if it doesn't look so good, then what changes can we make in order to improve it? Yeah, so I think that's basically what I've got. I'd love to take your questions if you have any. And the last thing I guess I'll say is, when I talk about all of this, I feel like I sometimes am at risk of sounding a little bit pessimistic about like all the risks associated with food grade crops. And that's not my intention. I think food grade crops are a great way to incorporate things on your farm. And one of the things I often like to say is that there's no such thing as a agnostic farmer. And what I mean by that is every farmer believes super deeply in the work that they do on their farm, whether they're growing corn, soybeans, or wheat and rye, or buckwheat, or dry beans. And that makes some of these decisions that we make really emotional. And the cost of production, those analyses and that kind of work we put in makes those decisions a little less emotional in a good way. It makes them a little bit more objective so we can actually figure out like, this is a good decision, this is a not so good one. We can still love our work and be emotional about it, but at the end of the day, we all want to, farm another year. So, yeah, that's what I've got. Questions? Yes.
This is just like a little bit of an observation. We found in New York, we did a lot of food stuff, and one of the things that's really struck me being here is like how much of a difference access to good markets has had for us. And I really one of the services, you know, we've all worked really hard in New York to develop these markets. One of the services that you could consider offering in some of these Rieth and chips is, you know, some sort of credit terms. It's really easy to look at the cost of ownership or the loss of interest, but, you know, that market's going to be a permanent thing. If you have a project that you really believe in, sometimes that's much more valuable than, you know, like you said, it's
Yep.
a tricky situation. It can be a sticky topic. We've been burned a couple times, but like, those are some of our most important relationships, are the ones that we, you know, the Bank of Austria gave them a loan for a year.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the comment was, if you didn't hear it, like, you know, looking at buyer relationships from a long-term perspective means that sometimes you gotta kind of be a creditor almost. You have to extend a line of credit so that your upstart buyer can get through their rough patch to get, you know, to pay you. And hopefully the idea is that that's a net benefit for both you and the buyer later down the road, because if you both can grow your businesses, that means they're buying more grain from you and probably at a certain point in time, maybe paying you even a better price for it. So that's a great observation. Thanks for bringing that up. Yes.
Do you have some mechanisms then for either contracting or searching a buyer to help offset some of that risk from their failure to pay, or like a bankruptcy and having a clawback, and you know they might pay you but you have to give the money back?
Sure.
How do you handle that?
Yeah, so the question here was, do you have mechanisms for, like, what happens if a contract goes south, basically, if the buyer can't take it or can't pay, and do you have a way to, you know, not be stuck holding the bag, so to speak, with that monetary investment? And yeah, again, I think it depends on how you write the contract. I think the position that we've been in, most of the time it hasn't got to a point where we have to, like, be the collector, so to speak. But we usually write in a provision in the contract where, like, hey, if you can't pay us or are not in a position to receive this grain, we as a farmer retain the right to pursue another buyer, to pursue another, like, this contract is null and void because you can't take it or can't pay us, so we're going to put this grain somewhere else and get paid. That's usually the approach that we've taken, and ideally, you know, you never have to take it. And we haven't really had to do that. I can think of maybe one time we kind of had to go down that path. And I'm sure there's other avenues you could go there, and a lawyer would probably be good advice in some of that. And each state, I think, has some differences in how they handle grain contracts on a larger scale. But yeah, great question.
Bankruptcy, they can actually get your money back, and depending on the state, you know, for 90 days after
Right.
they paid you. So
Right, exactly.
you can ask, right?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Where can you find forward contracts?
Like examples? Yes, great question. I think I would probably turn you first to some of the land grant universities will have samples of forward contracts. Alyssa, you have other? Farm Commons, yeah. Great. Yeah, and some of the contracts you'll find online, you'll readily see that they need some pretty serious, like, editing to get them to fit your particular context. So yeah, it's definitely worth looking around for a couple examples to kind of get something that feels like it fits your farm. Yes.
Yeah, say you're marketing food grain and it didn't meet the specs in the contract.
Mm-hmm.
Would the buyer automatically reject it, or would you expect them to negotiate a lower price?
Yeah, good question. So the question here was, you know, if your grain doesn't meet the spec you outlined in the contract, then what happens? And there's primarily two ways that we've seen this go about in our contracts and how we've written them. One is either the buyer might still purchase the grain, but at a reduced price because it didn't meet spec, or what we usually say as a last resort is if the grain doesn't meet spec and the buyer no longer wants it, then the farmer retains ownership, and we can either A, seek a different buyer, or B, usually the last resort is sell it as feed grade. So you still get something, but it's not really what you wanted. So yeah, good question. Yes?
What percent of your acres do you devote to these specialty food grade crops?
That's a great question. In my first answer, Tucker, you think it's about 50%? Yeah, about 50% probably. So and I think that's intentional too, right? I mean, it's easy to look at this and say like, hey, you have a higher price, your gross profit or your gross revenue is higher on these acres you're doing food grade. And I think our perspective is like, we actually like a little bit of the security of contracting some yellow corn and soybeans from a feed grade perspective, to not only just have a toe in a different market entirely, but also like cash flow. If a buyer can't take grain in January or February, if a food grade buyer can't, we might be able to sell the corn and beans in January, February to help like cash flow through the winter, leaner months of the farming. So we like to have that flexibility of like having our hands in both markets. So yeah. Yes, sir.
Kind of piggybacking off of his question, how do you, when you're looking at a new food grade market, something you haven't grown before, trying to figure your cost of production and also figure terms of the contract, how do you have confidence in what you're going to be able to yield and how that translates to cost of production, and have confidence that you're going to be able to meet specs, test weight, whatever?
Yeah, that's a $1 million question, I think. So the question was like, if you're growing a new crop, how can you establish a cost of production if you don't know how it's going to yield, or you don't know if you're going to be able to meet spec, or any number of factors for a new crop, right? And that's there's probably not a perfect answer here. I think a table like this has really helped us analyze that like risk reward. Like, let's say, I mean, buckwheat's a good example, because we didn't know a whole lot about growing buckwheat, and I had no idea what to expect. And so you can read university publications that would say you can, expect 50 bushels to the acre, and others might say 20, and others might say, 45, and you don't really know where you're going to come out, especially in an organic system. So I think looking at an analysis like this, where I know like a range of yields or a range of prices that would work for us, and I guess that's helpful to kind of know if I'm even in the ballpark, or if I'm even close, and maybe do like a little bit of preliminary price discovery about like, what are people maybe in even another state or another region getting for this crop, and can that apply to what I'm doing? And even at that price, can I make money? I think incrementalism is usually the way that I go about it, in that I try to grow a relatively small amount first and then kind of increase from there. That's a little bit of a chicken and the egg situation, because a buyer might have a minimum of a truckload. And so then you're kind of, yeah, I wish there was a better answer there, but the software and this kind of program that we've looked into, this has been, I think, probably the most helpful thing to kind of analyze it, because then it's not just a number we're shooting for. It's like, this is the range of where we could land that makes sense to us. So, yes.
What's your average acre for your crop, or your specialty crop? Like, are you growing 5 acres or something, 10 acres or something?
Yeah, that's a good question. The question here was like, what's your average, like how many acres are you putting toward a specific food grade crop? It really depends on the year, and sometimes it might depend on what we can contract. So like, I'll use barley as an example. If that's a crop that we decide to grow, we'll probably only grow as many acres as we can contract. And some years that might be 20, and other years that might be 40. And so that might then influence like how many acres of wheat and rye we plant, because they're all getting planted at the same time. So it's really this like moving Sudoku puzzle of, especially on the food grade side, it's really dependent on what we can get contracted or what we feel very confident in being able to market. We do 40 or 50 acres of this one variety of open pollinated corn just about every year, because we've had this one relationship with this one distiller, and then we know they're going to buy this many bushels, and we've grown it enough years now to expect this particular yield from those number of acres, and that's an easy thing to plug into the crop plan. But not everyone is that, I guess, cut and dry.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Are you doing the grain cleaning yourself before you're moving it?
That's a great question. So that question there was, are you doing the grain cleaning yourself before you move it? And short answer is no, we're not. We're very fortunate to work with a grain cleaner about half an hour from us in southwestern Michigan that does a great job. And so we pay him, on a per pound basis typically to clean what we need cleaned. And that means we might incur a little bit higher cost than doing it ourselves. But the nice part is we can save that labor, and I know what that cost is going to be ahead of time. So there's no surprises. If the gravity table breaks down, that one's not my problem, at least. But no, we feel really fortunate to have that relationship, and a lot of farms clean on their farm because they don't have that access. So, yeah.
Have you had forward contracts ever that you weren't able to fulfill because of crop loss? And if so, or just in general, any recommended language around that?
Yeah, so the question there was, have we ever had a contract that we weren't able to fill for volume because of crop loss or some other factor that prevented us from being able to deliver? That's a great question. I don't think we've ever been in that situation. We have had situations where it wasn't a formal contract, but we actually came up short on delivering to another buyer. Where, you know, they might say like, hey, we'd really like to have 5,000 pounds of this corn. And, you know, I say, yeah, we can do additional 5,000 pounds. And then it turns out, well, we only had 3,500 pounds in the bin left. So what do we do now? And I think that speaks to, you know, the comment earlier about building the relationships with your buyers. I think most of the times folks are understanding, and often we will turn them to another farmer that we know might be growing a similar crop to fill that void. And, you know, if you have these relationships, a lot of times, even with the smaller buyers, folks are readily and kind of willing and available to kind of be a little bit flexible. And maybe we'll try to help them out with the transportation if it's coming from some other place or something like that. But yeah, fortunately, we haven't been in that position too often.
One just follow-up question on that. With the economics of food grade crops, how much has crop insurance to date in whatever form factored into your operation?
That's a great question too. And the short answer to that is very little. It seems to be easier to kind of incorporate that into more of the corn soybean paradigm, because a lot of the crop insurance policies are based on an APH, or your average production history. And with some of these open pollinateds and different crops, not only are they sometimes fall out of like outside the definition of what an insurable crop looks like, but your APH is all over the place. You know, if the open pollinated corn falls down, then you get a really low yield, which actually might be a lot lower than normal. And so there's like a lot of other variables there to consider. I know that's something that we're working on for this year, is to kind of try to make that system a little bit more robust for us, because we think it can be an important part of looking at your whole farm economics, is where does crop insurance kind of fit in. But it's been kind of a slow process for us. Yeah.
You actually can't insure open pollinated corn with federal crop insurance subsidy program.
There you have it. Yeah, you can't, the comment there was you cannot insure open pollinated corn with federal crop insurance. And that, I think, checks out with what we've seen before too. And there, you know, it kind of depends on what your agent is how willing they are to kind of look at things from a different perspective too. But yeah, some of these things are just different enough where they're really not in the paradigm of what we're used to seeing for federal crop insurance, or what can be subsidized. So, yeah. Well, thank you all. Appreciate the questions. This is great. Yeah.